Oh, I think he's starting a fight. No, he's walked off. Walk away, mate, walk away. Bear in mind that Alexandria, over the course of its lifetime, it experiences earthquakes and tsunamis, and yet the lighthouse of Alexandria, it still stands until the Middle Ages. The Egyptians didn't really depict their gods in anthropomorphic form as you have here, but the Greeks did. And so you have this kind of god of Egyptian elements, but also Greek elements combined together. Chickens. Nice. Welcome to Echoes of History. I'm Tristan Hughes. I'm the host of the Ancients podcast and a lover of all things ancient history. I do have a particular love of Hellenistic history, and one of the key cities of the Hellenistic world was Alexandria in Egypt, or as they called it, Alexandria by Egypt. And today I'm delighted to say that I'm going to be giving you a tour of Alexandria, which was recreated in Assassin's Creed Origins. As an idea, we're going to be starting at the western entrance to Alexandria. We're going to be going along the main road, the Canopic Way, stopping off first of all at the Mouseion and then the Great Library of Alexandria, before making our way along the harbour front towards the theatre, and then to the centrepiece of the city, the tomb of Alexander the Great, the Soma, and then out of the eastern entrance of Alexandria to the Hippodrome, before we go back to the Paneion overlooking Alexandria, and then the Serapeion, also on another rocky plateau overlooking the city, before we finish off by crossing the Great Bridge to the island of Pharos and laying eyes on one of the wonders of the ancient world, the Pharos, the Lighthouse of Alexandria. Now, if you want to see the full version of this video of me talking on and on and on about Alexandria, from the sewers to what may have happened to Alexander the Great and chickens, well, you can watch the full video on the Echoes of History YouTube channel. So head over there. Let's get into it. So we're starting at the grand western entrance of ancient Alexandria. Now, Alexandria's position meant that, yes, there were formidable walls and they were for defence, but also that they were only on two sides of the city, because the northern side of Alexandria was protected by the Mediterranean and the south by a big lake called Lake Mareotis. So we're now inside Alexandria at the western end, and we are currently walking down the main avenue, a beautiful avenue as described by one of our sources who visited Alexandria. And this was called the Canopic Way, or the Canopic Way, after the nearest branch of the River Nile to Alexandria, the Canopic branch. And we hear that this route, it went through the length of Alexandria. It almost bisected Alexandria in two, and it was some 40 stades long, which is roughly 5 miles, 8 kilometers long, and it was renowned for its beauty, and it's kind of reflected here. It looks very clean, but it's very wide, and supposedly it was some like 8 lanes wide. Part of that, yes, of course, was for the splendor. I also think part of it, of course, was for traffic, as you can see right there, but also the fact that in ancient Alexandria, as the capital of the Ptolemaic kingdom, you would have had many different processions going up and down the road. These processions would have included statues being wheeled along on carts, probably also elephants as well, and lots of soldiers, lots of horsemen. So they did have very, very wide roads in Alexandria, epitomized by the Canopic Way. Another key feature of Alexandria is, as you can see, you're looking over now and you can see a canal down to your right. And Alexandria was famous for its great large and wide roads, but also for its cisterns and its water system. They dug a canal that linked Alexandria to the Canopic branch of the River Nile to ensure that there was a lot of fresh water that came into the city. So Alexandria also became highly renowned for the great skill of its subterranean systems, of its cisterns. I always say that to get the best sense of an ancient city, you do need to understand its waterworks, its cisterns. They're such a key part of the city. So the whole city of Alexandria, initially, like the founder is Alexander the Great. It's really built under his successors in Egypt, the Ptolemies. And we do hear about the architects, the main architects behind it. One of them was a figure called Deinocritus, and he is very much a champion of the grid system. Alexandria is built in a kind of very much a Greek Hellenistic model town, grid system that had been championed by a figure called Hippodamus of Miletus, favoured by the likes of Aristotle, who of course, that famous philosopher who also has a strong link to Alexander the Great, and then to the Ptolemies, and Alexandria becoming a great centre of learning and knowledge. So Alexandria is built, it is very much this kind of grid system, the main streets like the Canopic Way, and then streets going off in right angles too. We also hear of the man behind the creation of the irrigation systems and the hydraulic engineering, and his name was Crates. So most of Alexandria was relatively flat, but the city itself was built on two key geological ridges. So with Rome being the city of seven hills, I like always saying that Alexandria is kind of the city built on two ridges. But those natural ridges did really help with Alexandria, because you might initially think that its position quite near the River Nile and the Canopic branch of the River Nile meant that it would be susceptible to flooding every year when the Nile flooded. However, these ridges helped protect Alexandria when the annual flooding happened. And another interesting fact about that is that when the flooding happened, or when the canal that linked that branch of the Nile with Alexandria, when the water raised but didn't flood the city, that helped clear all the cisterns out. So actually that kind of benefit of the flooding of the Nile, that annual flooding, did actually help with the clearing out of the cisterns. But I've talked enough about cisterns. Let's move on to where we are now. This is the first big building of the tour. This is the Mouseion. As with several buildings that we'll see in Alexandria, we know the names of them and we know quite a bit about their purpose and their function. How they actually looked, we know less about. That information doesn't survive in as much detail in our surviving sources. But we do know the purposes. The Mouseion was one of the central buildings in Alexandria that linked this city to becoming one of the great centres and the great centre of knowledge and learning in the ancient Mediterranean. Mouseion literally translates as the shrine of the Muses, and the Muses were the goddesses of learning and knowledge. So unsurprisingly, the main purpose was a research centre. You can see people there, they are working on manuscripts, on papyrus, because the Mouseion was very closely linked to the great library of Alexandria. Scholars would come to Alexandria from far and wide, wanting to look at works of various different academic fields that was in the Great Library, and then they would come and do research on those works at the Mouseion. We know that with these scholars, that once they came to Alexandria, they had many benefits. Once again, adding to that idea of the Ptolemies, they really wanted their city, Alexandria, to be this great centre of knowledge. So many perks for scholars who visited here. They would be exempt from tax, they would be given accommodation and food, probably in and around the Mouseion too. So this is an interesting field that we hear about being studied in the Mouseion, which is the field of anatomy, the work on dead bodies, on corpses, on human remains, to understand more about how the body functioned. Indeed, one of the most famous anatomists, sometimes dubbed the father of anatomy, was someone called Herophilus of Chalcedon. And he lived in the 3rd century BC, and we know that he went to Alexandria and he worked at the Mouseion, and he performed many vivisections, so much so that he got quite an infamous reputation later. I believe one early Christian writer, Tertullian, labels him a butcher. That's interesting. You can actually see in Greek on that parchment and that scholar right there, the word Pythagoras. So mathematics was another big field that was studied and advanced at the Mouseion at Alexandria, alongside other fields, whether it be poetry, history, astronomy, as we've already just seen in regards to anatomy, and so many other fields as well. So all different scholars in different academic fields would come to Alexandria, would examine works related to their field, kept in places like the Library of Alexandria, and then do research on those at the Mouseion. So walking along the streets a bit more, you can notice once in a while, quite a lot of the people are looking very Greek, very cosmopolitan. I mean, Alexandria is divided at the beginning into kind of 3 main districts. You've got the Egyptian district in the west, Rakotis, which is the name given to the old settlement that was in that area of Egypt before Alexandria is founded. You then have in the middle the most prestigious part, which was the Greek and the Macedonian quarter, called the Brucharium, and which was where like the great library and the royal quarters were kept, where we're walking right now. I would probably say this is the Greek quarter of Alexandria. And in the eastern part, you have the Jewish quarter as well, where many people spoke Aramaic and knew Hebrew as well. But that all helped in regards to things like, as mentioned earlier, translations and so on. You had all these different people who spoke different languages who could aid to the gathering of knowledge in Alexandria. One of my favorite facts as well is you also have records of Buddhist monks walking in the streets of Alexandria, once again hinting at something that will basically go to the next level under the Romans, which was this amazing trade between the Indian subcontinent and the Mediterranean, and Alexandria was a key market of that trade, and that really flourished in the centuries following this, when the Roman Empire controls Egypt firsthand. So now we are emerging in front of the facade of the Great Library of Alexandria. As mentioned earlier, we know a lot about the function, we know a lot about some of the people who worked at the library, and kind of key stories from the library and how big a centre of research it was. In regards to its actual design, we don't know that much, but we can presume, as it was state-sponsored, funded by the Ptolemies, very keen on making Alexandria the greatest centre of knowledge in the world. Watch out for that horseplay. We can imagine it would be grand with, different coloured columns, statues in front. The facade right there, the creators of Assassin's Creed Origins, they have based it on another historical example, which is the library of Celsus, or Celsus, dated to the 2nd century, if I remember correctly, which is at Ephesus, one of the most striking remains you can see at Ephesus when you walk down the street into the historical site today. So that is the historical inspiration for this beautiful facade you can see here as the front of the Great Library. You can also see an Egyptian element to your left, an obelisk, and we've passed sphinxes already on our tour, once again highlighting how Alexandria, another key purpose of it is to kind of emphasize this kind of harmony between Greeks and between Greeks and Egyptians when the Ptolemies are ruling Egypt. We're entering into the Library of Alexandria now. Yes, I did notice those statues there, and yes, I know that they're not coloured. We'll get more to that in time, but we've got time. One thing I will also make you think about is also the mosaics that you see on the floor, because Alexandria was famous for its beautiful mosaics as well. At its height, which is probably a century or so before this game is set, it may have had as many as 700,000 to 1 million scrolls in the library. That there, recognizable by the horns on the top, that is Zeus Ammon, and he is holding in his hands a cornucopia. So we know that in the library itself, the scrolls were stored up high, as you can see on either side in those kind of ancient Hellenistic equivalents of shelves, in central rooms, in the main rooms, and these were called bibliotheca. And what you will also notice here, a key fact, is that there are no kind of codex-shaped books at this time. Those haven't been invented yet. The texts are wrapped up in scrolls, and those scrolls will be placed on top of each other, and they're quite easy to take out. Staff is another big thing at the Library of Alexandria, because we know that in this library that there was the category system. So all of these different various works were sorted depending on their nature. So let's say you wanted to go to the Library of Alexandria to look at one of the works of Euripides, one of the great tragedians of ancient Athens. Well, you could find that. There were probably clay labels or something indicating which area of the library, which particular shelf housed the tragedies or certain works of playwrights like Euripides or Aeschylus, and then you could go and take it out. Hellenistic equivalent of a book loan is not being able to take it out and then leave the city. You weren't allowed to do that. Once the scroll was in Alexandria, once it was in the royal quarter, it stayed there. But if you were a scholar, you could get your hands on it, and then you could go somewhere like the Mouseion that we've already seen and do further research on it. An interesting part with the library's beginnings is it goes right back to the beginning of the Ptolemaic dynasty and Ptolemy the First. If we say that Alexander's the one who founds Alexandria, it's Ptolemy the First who really brings it to the next level. What I was saying earlier with Ptolemy the First is, one of the things he does when he adds to the great glamour and splendor and wanting Alexandria as his new capital of the Ptolemaic kingdom, the Greek, the Macedonian dynasty that comes after Alexander the Great, that Ptolemy, it's his spear one possession after becoming the new ruler of Egypt following Alexander the Great's death in the late 4th century. One of the key buildings that he sponsors is the creation of the Great Library. And we know from very early on, first with a key figure called Demetrius of Phalerum, he is tasked with going far and wide and getting basically all of the books in the world. So it was a very ambitious idea to try and collect all of the knowledge, all of these works and to get them to the Library of Alexandria. Now, those works were spread all across the Greek world and, of course, beyond the Greek world in places like Mesopotamia and so on. And what they did was kind of embrace the wealth of Egypt and to pay people who wanted, support, who wanted to keep in the good books of the Ptolemies, because they became very powerful in the Hellenistic period. And then they would make copies of them. Sometimes they would get the original works, the priceless original works, and then give back copies to the places where they'd taken the works from and keep the originals, which wasn't very, most ethical of things. They did it with Athens, for example, with the great works of tragedians. But it's a funny part of the story of the Library of Alexandria, how they ended up getting the originals of some of the most priceless works in their eyes, particularly works of figures like Homer, Aristotle, and the works of great tragedians and so on. There would have been a lot of staff at the Library of Alexandria. You can see a figure there. He may well be translating one of the works into Greek, maybe into Aramaic or Egyptian, or an Egyptian scholar or an Aramaic scholar translating a work, for instance, maybe an ancient Egyptian text in either Demotic or hieroglyphics into Egyptian. One of the most famous and well-known translations that occurred in the Library of Alexandria was the translation of the Hebrew Bible, of the Old Testament. So we know that there was a big Jewish quarter in Alexandria, and you would have had figures, scholars who would have worked in the great library who spoke Hebrew, spoke Aramaic, and would have translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek, and that's called the Septuagint. I've said it before, but I'll say it again. I mean, the beauty is really emphasized in this game, and I think it's quite right to, and then kind of those beautiful kind of outdoor areas too, with plants and gardens and kind of beautiful natural areas. We know that there were natural areas in the Mouseion, that research center adjacent to the Great Library as well, which would help scholars in their research. There may even have been a place with some exotic animals which these researchers could study. I'm not going to say the word zoo, but almost like a mini paradise kind of area to kind of help certain scholars if they're looking at kind of biology and botany and so on, kind of the ancient equivalent of botany, kind of learn more about that. So we're heading down now to the waterfront, and this part with the great lighthouse of Alexandria in the distance, this is part of the big port, the big port at Alexandria called the Portus Magnus. A lot of archaeology has been done on parts of the Portus Magnus because parts of it today are underwater. So Alexandria, and particularly the eastern harbour of Alexandria today, you find a lot of remains of ancient monumental buildings beneath the waves, and figures like Frank Godiot and the likes have been working there for decades and making extraordinary discoveries. And here you have at this harbour front almost an extension of the Great Library. Once again, you can see stacks of texts rolled up on top of each other here, and that certainly makes sense because we know that over time boats that sailed into Alexandria, there were also agents of the library in the ports, and they would check boats to see if they had any works, any books, any texts in their possession, and if they did, those agents, they had the power to confiscate them and then to make copies to see if it was a valuable work and to see if they had it. If they didn't have that work, then they would take the book away, they would quickly make out a copy, hand back the copy to those people, keep the original, maybe give the person who owned that boat, give them a little bit of a reward, a monetary reward, and then they'd be allowed to go their way. So once again, there was this confiscation of books as well by boats entering Alexandria. This did lead to the threat of forgeries and almost this black market of a book trade. Yes, a black market of a book trade as well, because people realized how valuable it could be. If they entered Alexandria and said, I have a particular work, or I saw Aristotle give this lecture and I've written it down here, no one else has got it. You know, the scholars of Alexandria, those agents would say, okay, we'll have it. Which meant that to ensure that it was a real copy, there were people in the library who had to, their job was to see what was a forgery, to try and figure out what was a fake and what was real, and then decide on it. So there was a black market, a forgery market of books that emerged in this period, as well as people realized they could potentially make some money from selling books to the Great Library. So we're entering now into one of the most recognizable types of structures in an ancient Greek and indeed a Roman town. This is the theatre, which was along nearby the Canopic Way. The play being performed there, if our memory serves me correct, is the Dyskolos, basically the Grouch, and that was a play written by Menander in the 4th century BC, and I believe we know about it from a papyrus in Egypt, so maybe that's why the creators of Assassin's Creed Origins decided to show this play here. Now, the theatre itself is Roman in its look. You know, kind of got the big kind of backstage part, but also kind of the main shape of the theatre in how it is semicircular in its design. Greek theatres were a bit more horseshoe in its shape. I believe they've done this because it is based on a Roman theatre at Cyrene, another of these extraordinary Hellenistic cities, beautiful cities along the north coast of Africa in what is present-day Libya. So they're built in this way to amplify acoustics. So you have people performing here where our character is right now, and you'd have people sitting in the rows above. You normally have the most elite figures sitting nearest to it, nearest to the performance. Would have been one of the main entertainment buildings of Alexandria. So we're entering now into what is the centerpiece of ancient Alexandria, and it is the tomb of its founder, of its namesake founder, the tomb, the grand and majestic mausoleum of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great's body ends up in Egypt, effectively because Ptolemy I hijacked it, one of the most extraordinary heists in history, a couple of years after Alexander the Great's death. His body's initially buried in Memphis, because that was where Ptolemy's original capital was, but is later moved to Alexandria, and by the end of the 3rd century BC, it's placed in this beautiful, grand mausoleum, which is simply known, Strabo calls it the Sema, but I think it was actually called the Soma. Most people think it was called the Soma, which literally means the body, and it's named after the body of Alexander the Great. And the street that it was on was called the Street of the Soma. So important and big and majestic was this tomb to the whole identity of Alexandria. Got those big statues there. The one on the left, the stance looks very similar to that of the Augustus Prima Porta, if I'm not mistaken. So we know that several ancient writers visited the tomb of Alexander, as did many different famous ancient rulers. But they don't give too many detailed accounts regarding its architecture. We know that it was located in the royal quarter of Alexandria, close to the palaces of the Ptolemies, and also close to the tombs of the Ptolemies as well. One of the keys to the Ptolemies and their legitimacy as Greeks or as Macedonians ruling over Egypt was to emphasize their closeness to Alexander the Great, because they favored this idea, this myth, that Alexander was actually the son of the last native Egyptian pharaoh of Egypt, a man called Nectanebo II. And so the Ptolemies want to align themselves with Alexander to emphasize that they also are the legitimate successors of Alexander. And one of the ways they did it was by having their tombs right next to the magnificent tomb of Alexander, right next to the Soma. So the Ptolemies, even with Alexander's body, physical body, link themselves closely to Alexander and his memory, because it's absolutely crucial to their legitimacy. And here we have it, the tomb of Alexander the Great. Alexander was mummified, and his body, lots of precious aromatics and the like, and his breastplate and his armor and everything was there. It was originally placed in a gold coffin. However, by the 1st century BC, Ptolemaic power had waned, and Ptolemies hired a lot of mercenaries in their armies. And one Ptolemy the 10th, they all call themselves Ptolemy, but he needs to pay his troops. And Strabo says that the way he did it was to melt down the gold coffin and to replace it with either one made of glass or crystal. One of my favourite quotes of all time is Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, visits the tomb of Alexander and admires the tomb. And then he's asked by the local officials, would you also like to now go and have a look at the tombs of the Ptolemies buried close by? And Augustus kind of scoffs and he says to them, I came to see a king, not a bunch of corpses. So I don't know what those are to the left, but I've seen bundles of them as we've gone through this walk of Alexandria. And I'm guessing they're bundles of papyrus, because I saw quite a few at the port where next to the Library of Alexandria. I might be wrong, but it's a great tangent for me to quickly talk about papyrus and its importance to Alexandria and the library and this place as a centre of knowledge. Because papyrus, of course, was the main writing material for all of these works that were stored and then wrapped up in scrolls in the Great Library and other libraries that emerged throughout Alexandria. And the Ptolemies of Alexandria, the librarians, and they start getting a little bit, paranoid might be the wrong word, anxious, worried that the emergence of other libraries in the Mediterranean world, particularly places like Pergamum and Athens as well, and they start to see great libraries emerging there, and them also collecting a lot of different works. And there's a story that the Library of Alexandria wants to stifle this. And what they have on their side is that they have the monopoly of papyrus, because papyrus is created along the River Nile in Egypt. And so they effectively monopolize papyrus. They prevent it being exported to places like the library at Pergamum, which stifles those scholars of using that writing material. But those scholars figure a way around it. They develop instead the writing of, writing on animal hides. And they develop what is today parchment. So you get the development of parchment is partly due to this ban on the exporting of papyrus done by the people in the Great Library of Alexandria and so on to try and stall their rivals. So what you can see through here is you can see a lot of Egyptian artworks, depictions of figures in the guise of pharaohs, and that's very accurate. We have a bust of Ptolemy I surviving, for instance. I believe it's Ptolemy I, very much in the guise of an ancient Egyptian pharaoh, and in black granite as well. And that's, I think that's in the Louvre today, but it once again emphasizes, and you can see a sphinx right in front of us there. There are Egyptian elements to this city as well as Greek elements. There are Jewish elements as well, hinting at kind of that multicultural nature of this city once again. And the Ptolemies really wanting to put forwards that harmony between Greeks and Egyptians, with them as the new rulers of Egypt. So those figures are recognizable. So those are caryatids, kind of the sculptures of women as colonnades supporting a structure. The most famous examples of caryatids that we have surviving from the ancient world come from the Acropolis in Athens, because you have caryatids as one of the key colonnade features of the Erechtheion. Then we have downtown Alexandria. I don't know, downtown, but like a more residential area of Alexandria. We've kind of been keeping to the main monumental areas of Alexandria so far in this game, like the big buildings sponsored by the royal Ptolemies, kind of the key buildings of Alexandria that we remember today, and also key buildings associated with an ancient Greek Hellenistic town. But at its height, there were hundreds of thousands of people who lived in Alexandria, probably more than 300,000 people. One thing I also like here is the emphasis on, as you'll see in places like Pompeii and Herculaneum, that there were multi-story buildings at this time, well supported all along the place. And sometimes you would have, overlooking the main streets, you'd have shops on the lower level, you'd have apartments on the upper levels as well. This feels cleaner than it obviously would have been back then, with easy things that, especially in residential areas, if you didn't have a toilet, you might have the equivalent of, what are they called? Little pots, chamber pots. Yes, you'd have the equivalent of a chamber pot or something like that. And I don't think it's too far-fetched to say that if someone couldn't be bothered to go down to the local sewer to empty it, or a local stream, that they just flung all the excrement into the street. Can imagine horse poo and stuff as well. The more dingy, stinky side of ancient cities, but it's still important to highlight. It's interesting that, they largely portray here, obviously it would have been bigger. I understand why the game doesn't show as many people as, filling the streets as they would have been, it's fair enough. And the main kind of types of transport they show are people on horses or on camels. You can imagine both being there, people on camels, Nabateans maybe coming from somewhere like Petra, the beautiful city of Petra today in southern Jordan. But you also need to imagine wagons. As mentioned, the Canopic Way that we're now going back along towards the eastern entrance now, several lanes wide, incredibly wide roads, really well designed for lots of carts and oxen going back and forth, all of this trade coming in. Also for processions, as mentioned earlier, big elephants going all along these roads too. So yes, I understand why the game has just kind of restricted it to horses and camels, but you should also imagine oxen and mules pulling carts full of trade goods and so on coming here. We're coming up to the eastern entrance of the Canopic Way, and the eastern entrance was known as the Gate of the Sun, and the western entrance was known as the Gate of the Moon. Now, if I was to guess, I'm presuming that's because the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, but I cannot say that with certainty because I don't know. All I do know is that this eastern entrance is called the Gate of the Sun, and the western entrance was called the Gate of the Moon. You have some soldiers over there as well. I mentioned earlier, I was intrigued by the lack of guards shown in this game, particularly in the Royal Quarter, making sure that no one off the street ran into the Great Library of Alexandria, ran into one of those main rooms, stole a few scrolls and ran out again into the streets. But you can imagine that they would have been guards protecting some of those most prized possessions of Alexandria. I think there was an excavation centuries ago which kind of revealed the layout of the walls, so people know where the walls were. And one of the big problems with Alexandria today is that we hear about it from accounts of people who went to Alexandria. That's one of our key sources of evidence, and we have quite a few of those, and from people who worked, scholars who worked in places like the Great Library. So we have those accounts. However, modern day Alexandria, much of it is above the ancient city. So large parts of Alexandria that are mentioned in the texts, like the tomb of Alexander, haven't actually been located because much of it is above, is beneath the modern city. So it's one of those kind of frustrations, but also just realizations that much of ancient Alexandria is still beneath the city that is still very much alive and, kicking today. So we have this entrance here today, and immediately screams Arch of Septimius Severus, or a Roman triumphal arch in Rome rather than Alexandria, I must admit. I don't know of any arch on this part of Alexandria, but, aesthetically it's pretty extraordinary. You have this, it doesn't look like they're sphinxes at all, but you have this avenue of creatures. What are they, cats, or I can't actually quite tell what they are, or lions, maybe avenues of lions either side there. And that's probably hinting at what we know from ancient Egyptian temples, like the avenue of sphinxes and so on, or ram-headed sphinxes, for instance, you get at the entrance to Karnak. And we can imagine that Ptolemy did, at certain parts of Alexandria, integrate those Egyptian elements, once again to emphasize that kind of hybridity of Alexandria, that Egyptian and Greek culture. So don't be surprised if there were those kind of things that alluded to those more ancient Egyptian avenues of sphinxes along roads in ancient Alexandria. So we're outside of the walls, and we're at a place where the Greek geographer Strabo talks about there being a hippodrome. So this is the hippodrome, which comes from the Greek words hippos, which means a horse, and dromos, which largely translates, loose translates as race. So it gives a sense of the main activities that would be happening in the hippodrome, as given by that picture there. Horse racing, chariot racing almost certainly too. So Strabo mentions it being a hippodrome being outside the walls of Alexandria. But other accounts talk about the stadium, also called the Hippodrome, being within the walls of Alexandria, in the southwestern corner of the city. And this hippodrome was known as the Lageion, and that is named after the ancestor of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the father of Ptolemy I, the real father of Ptolemy I, because Ptolemy also he likes creating stories in his reign that links himself to Alexander the Great. And one story is that actually he was an illegitimate son of Alexander's father. So once again, trying to link himself as kind of a brother by another mother to Alexander the Great kind of thing. But his real father, when he's serving as a general of Alexander the Great, he's referred to as Ptolemy, son of Lagus. And Lagus is a Macedonian nobleman. And the Lageion probably hints to Lagus, the father of Ptolemy I. Lots of trade would have been going on outside of this hippodrome, as emphasized here. Betting as well, gambling, a big part of sports in ancient Greece and Rome. So you can imagine people putting bets on their favorite riders, just like the librarians. Horse riders and chariot races and athletes, they would have all been celebrities of their day. And people would have had, the most famous and the most successful would have had their own followings as well. And although not shown here, you can imagine throughout a city like Alexandria, notifications, kind of billboards, probably graffiti as well, like you have surviving in places like Pompeii, telling people about when the next race would be, who would be racing in it, and whether there were any big names coming to race. So here we go, and we're at a high point of the city of Alexandria. And Alexandria was notably pretty low level. You have another kind of Acropolis area over there. That's the Serapeion in the distance. We'll get to that in a bit. But this, I believe, is the Paneion. And we hear about this in the account of Strabo, talking about various landmarks in Alexandria. And this was a temple dedicated to Pan, who's the god of nature and shepherds and herds. He's very much a nature god. And we hear that the Paneion is built. It's the mound that it is on is man-made. It's an artificial mound to give this temple some height. And he mentions that you could get amazing views of the whole city from here. So look, we've just seen the lighthouse of Alexandria. We're looking down towards where the tomb of Alexander the Great is that we visited earlier. Then there's the eastern gate down there of Alexandria and on towards the Hippodrome that we just visited. There you go, that's the Paneion to our left, kind of that tholos shapes, that circular Greek architectural shape called a tholos. You see them everywhere from the treasury of Atreus at the entrance to Petra, to the Philippeion in Olympia, to Delphi, and so on. Egyptian royal cartouches on the side of those colossal statues that don't look out of place that you see. I'm guessing the influence will be those great colossal seated Egyptian statues from the 2nd millennium BC at the Temple of Luxor, for instance, in present-day Luxor. And that statue right there, that's the Diaskobolos, the discus thrower, another very famous, one of the most famous examples of Greek statues that have survived, or at least survived in Roman copies. Once again, admire the beautiful mosaics. Alexandria was renowned for its mosaics and its artistic beauty. So mosaics aren't just Roman. They also have roots in Ptolemaic Alexandria too. One last thing on Pan. Naturally, he's associated with flocks and with shepherds. You also get a very famous, very graphic statue of Pan that survives, that was discovered in a garden at Pompeii, which shows him having sex with a goat. Just wanted to get that one in there as well. Pan, some have said, is also an influence on the creation of the image of the devil, kind of being half man, half goat kind of idea. And also the pan flute. The pan flute, its origins is from Pan, this nature god who played this musical instrument. So there you go. A few interesting facts about Pan too. I must confess, I never played the Assassin's Creed games, and I really hope that the developers aren't angry at me for saying that, but I do feel I've missed out with things like this. Like, it is a beautiful experience to do this walkthrough, and just to see the spaces, and the amount of care and attention to detail on certain things. Yes, of course, there are ways that it's, not 100% accurate, and you wouldn't expect it to be, but you really do immerse yourself in walking through this ancient city, and you can spot, for myself, you can spot out things and you can understand why they chose certain things, and it's just a fun experience. More Greek temple architecture you can see there. You can see those columns are the Corinthian order, I believe, by those kind of flowery tops. To the right, just passing the statue plinth there, those blue columns, they have those little volutes, one on either side. That epitomizes another style of classical Greek architecture called an Ionic column. So you've seen Corinthian columns like that tholos, that circular structure in front of us, and Ionic columns. I may just have missed it, but I haven't seen any Doric columns so far, which are more kind of the fluted, more archaic Greece, epitomizing great temples like the temples of Hera or Poseidon, maybe even Apollo actually, it's debated, at Paestum or Paestum in southern Italy. But that might just be because I haven't been looking for them. You see a little kid there with a very wide-brimmed straw hat. I believe that is the Petassos, and that you see them. You don't really see them in the archaeological records because they don't survive, but it's a common headwear that you see depicted on ancient Greek vases. So quite a key feature of ancient Greek clothing that you can see here. So as we go through, you see those different statues, and they are based on different Hellenistic or early imperial Roman statues, Roman and Greek statues from the ancient Mediterranean world. Yes, the key thing to point out is that they are not coloured, and originally, yes, they would have been adorned with very different, rather striking, some people say quite tacky is the wrong word, but kind of they look a bit weird to the modern eye today when you see them with colours. But yes, one thing that it doesn't show here is that those statues would have been coloured. But see if you can recognise any statues as we go along, because most of them are based on famous examples from throughout the Greek world and the Roman world. Oh, it's teasing me with the great lighthouse of Alexandria that you can see in the distance. Hopefully we're going to get there soon. Oh, I think he's starting a fight. No, he's walled off. Walk away, mate. Walk away. There he goes. It's interesting also looking at the clothing of these different figures as well. So you obviously got the Petassos Greek hats at times. White linen was popular with ancient Egyptians. There were different coloured dyes as well. Not purple. Purple was restricted to royalty, but you can imagine a kind of greens, blues, reds. Or just kind of standard white in the clothing that you can see with these people going around the place. And now it looks like we are in the southwestern part of the city. So we've done a lot of walking since doing the Paneion, and we are going up to what was described as one of the most beautiful, splendid temples in the ancient world. That survived for several centuries, and this was positioned atop the high point, one of the main high points of ancient Alexandria, this kind of Acropolis area, and this is the Serapeion. So the Serapeion is also constructed in the 3rd century BC. It's finished under Ptolemy III, and it was considered the most beautiful temple in Alexandria. There were 100 marble steps, a big elevation, lots of steps to get up to this temple, and those steps we've just gone up are actually really interesting and key part of its whole design, because, as mentioned, it was placed at the top of this rocky plateau. You can see the pyramids in the distance. That's interesting. But I've mistakenly not identified pyramids before in a certain YouTube video, so I've got nothing to say there. The pyramids are in Egypt, folks. The pyramids are near Memphis in Egypt, the Great Pyramid of Giza, just so you know. Now, as this temple was described as the most beautiful in Alexandria, you can imagine it adorned with gold, silver, bronze, beautiful columns like we can see here, elaborate, incredibly elaborate in its design to reflect the majesty of this temple and to the god that it was dedicated to. And this was a god called Serapis. And Serapis is central to the legitimacy of the Ptolemies ruling over Egypt. Now, there may well have been a god called Serapis in Egypt before the Ptolemies, but the version we have here, it's very much a syncretic god, kind of a mixture of Egyptian and Greek elements. Serapis on the Egyptian side is the mixture of Osiris, king of the dead, and Apis, the sacred bull deity. You have the Serapeion near Memphis in further south, and you had these Apis bulls, these sacred bulls that represented Apis when they died, and they were buried in these massive sarcophagi, granite sarcophagi beneath the ground. On the Greek side, the Serapis was kind of represented by Zeus and Hades. You have the pediment on top of that temple there that actually depicts the competition between Athena and Poseidon for control over Athens. So they've just put that on this temple, but that was one of the pediments of the Parthenon in Athens. So here you have the statue of Serapis, and he is a syncretic god, basically really put forward by Ptolemy to increase harmony between Egyptians and Greeks. The Egyptians didn't really depict their gods in anthropomorphic form as you have here, but the Greeks did. And so you have this kind of god of Egyptian elements, but also Greek elements combined together. He's wearing this hat called a calathos or a modius, which may well be for weighing up grain. Strongly linked Serapis is with fertility and rebirth and regeneration kind of thing. And you can see there in Greek at the bottom, the name of the god, Serapis. So we got offerings to that statue right there. Something I missed that I didn't say is that you will also notice kind of pools of water. We passed one earlier, and having sacred pools of water for ritual purposes and so on. That was common in Greek and Roman temples across the world. So it was not a surprise that you see pools of water in these kind of religious centers. Oh, I like this. This is a nod to, once again, to the Great Library of Alexandria, but also to when the Great Library in the 3rd century BC, Ptolemy III, basically they had too many texts, they had too many books, and they couldn't fit them all in the Great Library. And so they built a daughter library at the Serapeion. At the Serapeion, at this temple. And so at the Serapeion, yes, you had the main, kind of cult god and all the worship to Serapis. There's the pool I was talking about. But you also had a smaller library where some of the scrolls were placed during the rule of Ptolemy III. So the Serapeion, yes, primarily a religious temple, but it also had a small subsection, shall we say, of the knowledge is power part of Alexandria's story, a subsection of the Great Library of Alexandria. So, finally, we're heading to the island, the big island just off the coast from Alexandria, which is the island of Pharos. We are currently walking along the bridge that not only connected Pharos with main Alexandria, but also splits Alexandria's harbours in two. So you have the great harbour to this character's right, which we've already walked along the harbour front of, and you had another harbour to the left as well. So Alexandria has more than one harbour, and there's indeed in those great ports, they're divided into several different functioning harbours as well. This bridge is known as the Heptastadion, and that literally translates as 7 stadions or 7 states. And a stadion was a unit of measurement for the length of a running pitch. It's where we get the word stadium from. So this bridge was effectively 7 stadium lengths long, 7 running pitch lengths long. It's portrayed here as being very elaborate, and I think we can presume it would have been very elaborate. Kind of the main bridge connecting Pharos, on which there were harbour buildings, and of course there was, right at the edge of it, you have one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, which you can see in the screen already, the great lighthouse, the Pharos of Alexandria. So the Lighthouse of Alexandria, construction of it began in the reign of Ptolemy I, commissioned, and the man who oversaw it is a figure called Sostratus. It was only finished in the reign of Ptolemy's successor, Ptolemy II, Ptolemy Philadelphus. And yes, it became, and I stress became, one of the wonders of the ancient world. It's not on the earliest canonical lists. Back then, like, the wonder was the Walls of Babylon was the 7th one, but then the Walls of Babylon kind of gets removed and the Lighthouse of Alexandria is added. And it was the only practical wonder of the 7, kind of served a practical purpose. As you can see here, I think we'll get to it in a bit, but you can see like the beacon at the top, which was to help with sailors navigating into one of Alexandria's harbours and making sure that they didn't hit the island of Pharos. Now, the Lighthouse of Alexandria, it also stands, it's very formidable as a structure. And bear in mind that Alexandria, over the course of its lifetime, it experiences earthquakes and tsunamis. And yet, the Lighthouse of Alexandria, it still stands until the Middle Ages, until deep into the Islamic period of Alexandria. I remember doing an interview about the library, I've done one on the library as well, but also on the Lighthouse of Alexandria. And it seemed to be that the story of the lighthouse, you can almost divide it into 3 separate stages. The Hellenistic lighthouse, the first one created by Ptolemies. Then the Roman version, which I think very much is the vision you have here, with the 2 main tiers, which we'll get to in a bit. And then you get an Islamic version as well, where I believe a mosque is placed at the top of the Lighthouse of Alexandria, but don't ask me too much about. I don't know too much about that. But yes, this feels like it's the Roman version of the lighthouse. First of all, notice its colour, and Strabo talks about the Lighthouse of Alexandria being white in its colour, and it probably is a stucco effect to it. So it's painted with stucco on top to kind of gleam in the Egyptian sun. The structure of it is also interesting. What you can see at the bottom, you can see that kind of that first tier, which is quite rectangular, but you'll notice how it's kind of tapering in. And I think a key influence on the construction of the lighthouse, the first lighthouse, that first tier, the Hellenistic one, are from the pylons, not electrical pylons from today, but the pylons which are the great gateways of ancient Egyptian temples. Think primarily today the great temple complex at Karnak in Luxor, and you see how they taper in and they kind of move in slightly as well. And you can see clear influences of that on the building of the bottom layer of the lighthouse. In the Roman period, I think it really becomes, more majestic and has more of a function of a lighthouse, I'd even argue too. When you get that second layer added, which you can see is more octagonal there, and then you get where the light would have been right at the top, and above that would have been a statue of Zeus. We have depictions of the lighthouse surviving in coins and on this extraordinary vase actually found in Afghanistan, part of the Begram hoard, which shows a figure on top of the lighthouse. Now, that could be Zeus, or it could be Poseidon. The jury's out, but it's likely there was a statue on top of the lighthouse. And now finally, we're at the top of the lighthouse. Behind us is the fire that would have been kept burning to make sure that ships would not hit the Pharos, to help guide them into the harbours. I think this became more and more important in the Roman period, when more Roman ships were travelling at night. We don't even quite know about the fuel for the fire. We can presume maybe it's brushwood or something like that, although there's not too much wood in the area. But they must have just brought in supplies of wood to ensure that the fire kept burning. There's also this idea of bronze mirrors as well, being used to kind of help amplify the light. Thanks for joining me as I looked into this recreation of ancient Alexandria in Assassin's Creed Origins. If you want to learn more about the real history between the various Assassin's Creed games, then subscribe to our Echoes of History YouTube channel, where we feature interviews with leading experts, including myself, on the true stories, the real histories behind the various locations and events that make up the Assassin's Creed games.